Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Primary Sources Beyond History, Promoting Use Across the Disciplines, which is sponsored by Accessible Archives and Unlimited Priorities. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. Along the right-hand side, you'll likely see a Q&A panel. If you don't, you can click the three little dots button in the bottom middle part of your screen, and that will pull up a menu where you can find the Q&A. There's also there in that menu at the bottom a little dialogue cloud that you can click to turn on and off your chat. Please use the Q&A panel to submit questions for the speakers. We'll take some time at the end of the presentation to field as many of those as we have time for, so please do send them in throughout. And the chat panel, that's what you can use to communicate with me. If you're having any technical issues or have any other sort of questions that aren't for the panelists, you can send those to me through the chat, and we will chat privately to deal with those things. So I would say today we are using the hashtag ACRL Choice Webinars. So if you've got another screen handy, shout out to us. We're at choice_reviews on Twitter. And you can see that we are all of the other social media ways that you can reach Accessible Archives and Choice as well right there. So please feel free to tweet about us and add us, and we will be happy to have that dialogue with you. Also note that I am recording today's program, so everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to that archived recording. And our speakers today are Darby Orcutt and Nicole Eichmann-Kawara. And hanging out with us today, we've got Iris Haney for any questions folks may have about Accessible Archives. So with that, I think we are ready to get started. So I will turn the floor over to Darby.
Greetings. This is Darby Orcutt from North Carolina State University Libraries. And thank you for the strong interest you've helped to show in this topic today. We've got well over 1,000 attendees registered for today's webinar, and several hundred of you, and the number keeps growing by the second, who are attending live right now. And I think this exemplifies the fact that interdisciplinarity and cross-disciplinarity are increasingly common across the higher education landscape, as well as the fact that librarians are perhaps uniquely poised within our institutions to help our faculty and students address the challenges that come with this territory. It may also speak to the fact that we librarians have an awful lot on our plates these days in supporting wider and wider ranges of disciplines. So our hope is that today's webinar will help make your work as a liaison easier. What Nicole and I will be presenting today, we hope will give you some tips, some new ideas, but most importantly, some new ways of thinking fruitfully about how you and your instructional collaborators might use the rich resources that are primary source materials, better leveraging your online library collections to foster student learning and academic success. But first, I want to acknowledge the vast expertise that is represented by you, our attendees. Again, there are more than 1,000 of you registered, representing all kinds of institutions, large to small, and working with disciplines as varied as possible. While Nicole and I are facilitating this presentation and this conversation, we have by no means cornered the market on knowledge of this topic. And so we strongly encourage that we all learn from one another in the days to come by posting your own examples of using primary sources in diverse disciplines, using the Twitter hashtag primary sources beyond. I also know that some of you will be, and from your perspective right now are, listening in asynchronously later. And I want to encourage you to post as well, and let's keep this sharing and conversation going. So just what are primary sources? We're most used to the terms used with regard to the discipline of history, where primary sources more or less equates to contemporaneous accounts of events or social conditions recorded by someone who was there. Their value stems primarily from the presumption that sources in proximity in time and space to an event are potentially more accurate than later interpretations by others. Historians don't need to be sold on using primary sources. And honestly, many scientific disciplines, on the other hand, don't either, although they generally equate primary sources with research reports or original documentation from data sets to even original research articles. Today, we're going to focus on primarily historical resources, but on how these might be put to robust use within non-historical disciplines. I advise having something of a flexible attitude when working with faculty on primary source-related assignments. Depending on both their field and their personal taste, they may take narrower or more expansive views of what qualifies as a primary source. And what I see as the main reasons for these are two informational aspects of primary sources that librarians should be aware of, consider, and both of these can represent complex methodological issues, although whether or how these complexities need to be presented to students depends on the level and the pedagogical goals of the course at hand. The first of these is bias. All sources are biased, some overtly so, and reflecting a suasive agenda, some by simple virtue of being created within their particular historical and cultural context, and some by simple selection bias. For example, a data set can only contain the data sets that were collected, a photograph only depicts what a photographer framed within the shot, and so forth. Closely related is the other complex issue I want to mention, which is purposes. And by this, I mean both the original purpose or purposes, if they're even known, of the particular primary source, but also the purpose of the researcher, including the student researcher, who is now reinterpreting that primary source. It's important to understand that many, maybe most of the primary sources upon which we rely are essentially being misused by researchers. Meaning not something bad, but that we're now putting them to uses for which they were not originally created, intended, or perhaps have even been imagined by their creators. For example, land records originally recorded to document ownership of property are now most heavily used by genealogists. As you find with this article here, weather-related entries from a farmer's diary have been used to interpret patterns of climate change. What thinking about this may remind you of as a librarian is your library school training with regard to the basic reference question. When there's a reference question, in other words, a question that has not already been answered in a secondary source, we as librarians ask ourselves who at the time might have had interest in documenting information that could address this issue. Conversely, for pedagogical purposes, it probably most often makes sense for us to work something in reverse. We can instead look at the primary source materials to which we do have access, and from these, speculate on the types of research questions that students could ask or be assigned to investigate that would best meet the pedagogical goals of the instructor in that particular course. The academic success of students will be best facilitated by content that is digitized and easily accessible to them, contains strong metadata, and is complete and contextualized. I'll mention at this point, too, that by accessible, I also mean that you'll want to recommend to your faculty collections that meet actual accessibility standards for those students who may need to use assistive technologies. This is a major reason why we need to actively promote vetted library resources for course use rather than simply loose our instructors on the open web. I'm going to offer some specific examples here across disciplines, both that will show the importance of how you select primary source content for pedagogical use, and also how the same source collections can be used in diverse ways. I'm going to focus on traditional text resources, the types of content likely already a part of your library's online offerings, but maybe not being leveraged much beyond your history courses. But you'll find the things that I'm talking about will apply to a wide range of possible primary source materials. I'm going to start with the example of Godey's Ladies Book, a collection provided by Accessible Archives, our sponsor of today's webinar. Godey's was arguably the key American women's magazine of the 19th century, and therefore a great source to interrogate for all kinds of basic research questions. Accessible Archives' collection of Godey's meets the ideal criteria I noted before. Most notable are its contextualizing features. There's a brief and readable overview of Godey's that you find the first part of here. Importantly, both OCR text and page images are available for all the content, and all the content is actually present, both for the individual issues, which include covers, tables of content, front matter, back matter, illustrations, and even all the advertising. And also, the content is there for the entire run of the magazine. Again, this is really significant with whatever primary source resource you're selecting. This sort of comprehensiveness not only helps students to get oriented into the source material more holistically, but also ensures that whatever conclusions are drawn through sampling techniques or other research techniques are more likely to be accurate. Let me pause here and give you a word of empowerment. As a librarian working with a course instructor, you do not need to be a specialist in the methodologies and content of that subject area. Honestly, that is what the course instructor should be. Your expertise as a librarian is in information sources, how they may be utilized, and how the overall research process works, both holistically and pragmatically. Now, why am I talking about research here in a webinar about pedagogy? Because whether or not the instructor conceives of it this way, using primary sources in the classroom is always a way of teaching students how research is conducted within the discipline. At the very least, of how to read a text using the tools, methodologies, or approaches of a particular field or fields. The great benefit for librarians in understanding this is that we can do what we do best, focus on the larger picture of how research is conducted, and appropriately leave it to course instructors to fully integrate assignments and examples into the course content. So I promised you easy. So here are a couple of steps that are useful in any research process and well worth calling out to students at any level, whether they're just getting the barest taste of how scholarly analysis works, or whether they're about to embark on their own more advanced original research. Annotation is an approach I've used to teaching using primary resources that is easily adapted to any disciplinary approach. Many of you are likely familiar with the Darwin Correspondence Project, an open access collection of Charles Darwin's letters and other writings. I pointed out it is not just a great online primary source database, but that it is itself an example of the practice of annotation. In an annotation exercise or assignment, students may be asked to annotate individually or in teams, creating linkages to course content, contextualizing problematic terms, or observing certain types of arguments, observations, or types of information contained within texts. As simple of a tool as Google Docs can be used to record student comments, or with a small learning curve, Hypothesis, which is a nonprofit tool that is out there. Hypothesis allows students to annotate web pages. For example, creating their own layer of comments directly overlaid upon any of Darwin's letters within the Correspondence Project, or any other web page that's on the open web. Annotation can underpin any sorts of interpretive methods, as well as itself often serves as a first step towards developing a coding system for particular analyses. And that is where I'm headed next, coding. Coding may be applied to develop and/or to test hypotheses and can be used in qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods research. While coding nowadays makes people think of computers, much coding work is still actually done manually by humans, or at least done by humans first or assisted by humans first in developing or checking subsequent computational approaches. Regardless, it serves as a valuable means of facilitating student learning about how research is conducted. Returning to the example of Godey's Ladies book, a communication course might look at the various genres represented within the magazine's contents, coding individual contributions as fiction, poetry, or nonfiction. A sociology course might wish to code the various main topics addressed by articles to draw conclusions about perceived interests of women. Magnifying the table of contents on this page, for example, you can see that there are several articles on fashion, which might be grouped with other ostensibly frivolous topics versus the one article that you see on health and hospitals, which might be counted with seemingly more serious topics, perhaps. One could further code the apparent genders of authors, looking for potential trends in whether men or women pen these, quote, serious or frivolous pieces of content. A larger trend perhaps suggested by looking at this issue's sole health-related article, which is credited to a man, versus 3 of the 4 fashion articles in this particular issue credited to female writers. Now, don't let the fact that I'm using 19th century content here as an example keep you from seeing that essentially identical pedagogical techniques might be used with even contemporary content. The challenges with 20th and 21st century primary sources come with access and especially comprehensiveness, primarily, as digitized collections for more current materials often come only as aggregated or worse, partially aggregated sets of articles, often without page images, advertising, or non-article editorial content. Looking at another page from Godey's Ladies book here, an economics perspective might look at the advertisements within the magazine, coding them according to a standard nomenclature of industries. What are the types of industries represented here? And how does that compare to the overall picture of what were the major consumer goods industries at the time? In similar ways, coding could be conducted to ascertain elements of or pose questions regarding, say, font layout and design, domestic representation of international events or international locales, public understanding of science, promotion and adoption of new technologies. The possibilities are virtually endless. Like annotation, coding of primary sources can underpin a wide array of interpretive methods. Again, both quantitative and qualitative, across diverse disciplines, including content analysis, grounded theory, framework analysis, discourse analysis, and the list goes on and on. As a practical matter, and especially the more frequently you find yourself being asked or having opportunity to collaborate on primary source exercises and assignments, it's useful to build your own portfolio of go-to primary source collections, ones that, again, are accessible, with strong metadata, and are complete, but also that you think might interest students and be made to serve the pedagogical needs in multiple courses across multiple disciplines. In fact, leveraging the same or complementary primary source databases across courses in different disciplines can not only make your life as a liaison easier, it can lead to some very interesting connections for your campus. I've worked with faculty on complementary course assignments where students in two different disciplines each bring their own disciplinary perspective to bear in an assignment on a single corpus of primary sources. And then through sharing that from course to course, benefiting greatly from the added perspective of the other field. These sorts of assignments can be very lightly linked, but still highly effective pedagogically, distinguishing clearly for students the advantages, the values of particular methodologies. At this stage, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Nicole, who will take us from here into the realm of more computationally assisted applications. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Darby, and our hosts, Accessible Archives, and Mike Dirks at ALA Choice. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm Nicole Eichmann-Kawara. I'm the Digital Scholarship Librarian at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm in the University Libraries in the Center for Research Data and Digital Scholarship. For the rest of our time together, I'm hoping to give a basic introduction to some, or just a few of the interdisciplinary digital research methods that combine qualitative and quantitative approaches and what they might look like. My goal is for you to have heard about just a few, or rather just a couple of the many digital scholarship and computational approaches for reading and analyzing primary sources macroscopically and visualizing them in interesting ways, as well as to introduce some common and mostly free tools that enable that digital or computational exploration. So over the last 2 decades, a variety of digital technologies and digitization projects have been created, and those have allowed us to explore primary sources in a much broader scale. With increased interest in digital research methods and primary sources among teaching faculty and students, there's a greater likelihood of you being approached to provide curricular support. So I think that most people think about big digital projects when it comes to working with digital primary sources, if it's not a close reading, but that's not always feasible, especially for those of us just getting started with learning those research methods and tools. So when you are approached for curricular support, I hope that you'll keep in mind that you can scaffold things and introduce working with computational approaches in bite-sized, manageable pieces that will also not overwhelm students, you, or the instructor. For instance, you and the instructor you're partnering with can introduce students to digital research methods through simple individual or group assignments and class activities that can live on their own or can be built up and incorporated into larger course projects. You can also be approached by researchers as well as teaching faculty from disciplines that are only recently incorporating computational methods into their scholarship. I should say that by researchers, I'm using that broadly. I'm including undergraduate and graduate students in that. The most common areas aside from the sciences that employ computational methods are likely to be what are known as the computational social sciences and digital humanities. Computational social science essentially takes traditional social science topics like democracy, security, economic growth, and inequality, and they analyze data and information in complex ways using methods like data mining, natural language processing, web scraping, data visualization, machine learning, and text analysis. And I'll talk a bit more about text analysis here soon. Similarly, digital humanities takes traditional humanities topics, such as dealing with change over time, the meaning of language and place, thoughts, actions, and creations by using these same methods, especially text analysis, mapping, and spatial analysis, and multimodal presentations of their data and their context. And by data, that can be broad. It can be a collection of text or primary sources, or information like metadata about collections of images, text, and geolocations. And of course, primary sources are often the data in some shape or form. So what are some of these computational methods that can be applied to primary sources? Although primary sources can come in multiple media formats, one place to start is working with textual sources and conducting text analysis, which is the process of distilling information from unstructured data, in other words, from the text. By using statistical inferences and examining word frequencies, relationships, text analysis can help researchers understand document collections that are prohibitively large for a close reading. In other words, it enables macroscopically reading textual data by looking for patterns in text. While you can conduct text mining projects and assignments that explore only these statistical patterns and relations, it often combines quantitative and qualitative reading. By that I mean the macroscopic reading helps facilitate close readings. For instance, one text mining application, topic modeling, allows you to look for thematic relationships across a large body of text through examining the most commonly co-occurring words and phrases, which may confirm your own theories about what the major themes and discourses are in a text or corpus, as well as potentially highlighting something that's unexpected. Let's say you work with a vendor like our host, Accessible Archives, to obtain the entire run of William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. It ran for 34 years, so it's a pretty large corpus. You would expect to see lots of co-occurring words, which would lend themselves to a topic. And we would probably see quite a bit on slavery and other issues related to enslaved peoples. But you might also discover the newspaper covered issues of violence towards Native Americans. From there, you could then drill down into the individual texts that are as part of the topics through topic modeling and perform your traditional close readings. Whether it's looking at word and phrase counts, comparing texts, or looking at topics across texts, text analysis is a great method for exploratory research that allows you, instructors, researchers, and students to come away with the skills of reading primary sources in large quantities and being able to quickly find patterns to help you orient your analysis. And I should also note that corpus building can be quite a process. In order to conduct text mining, you need to have machine-readable text. You can create plain text documents of OCR text on your own, but at scale, it's much more time-consuming. If there's a collection of primary sources, whether text for text analysis or images for image mining, you can often request the machine-readable formats from vendors. For instance, Accessible Archives, which I was really excited to learn, they include text and data mining as part of their license agreement, and they come in XML format. And this comes at no cost and takes usually less than 10 days for them to get that data to you, which is pretty amazing. We've heard of far longer periods here at CU Boulder, up to a year even. Usually I'd say 6 months tends to be the standard, so less than 10 days is absolutely amazing. And just as a plug for them, they may charge you for the media that it's on, like a USB drive or what have you, but the costs are so minimal that they often, quote, forget to send the bill. And this is pretty unique. Many vendors can take several months and charge for this service, and it's usually not very cheap. So let's see. Let's move on. I hope that you guys will take advantage of that text and data mining stuff from Accessible Archives. It's pretty generous. So some tools to get you oriented or started with some text mining applications in the classroom or for your own research. Here are just some common ones that are used particularly in the digital humanities and in the computational social sciences. Computational social sciences tend to use a lot more programming, like using R and Python, but as well as some of these other ones here. Voyant Tools is a web-based text mining tool that has these automatically generated visualizations. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. It's free. It's pretty fantastic. You just plug in your sources, and you can also plug in a URL, and you'll have several visualizations and tools to explore. Antcock is a desktop text mining tool that allows you to do a lot of the same things as Voyant. Mallet is the topic modeling tool of all topic modeling tools. So any other topic modeling tool you come across is probably based or has the backend set up from Mallet. Sketch Engine is not free, but they have a great free version. It's for computational linguistics. So if you're interested in exploring, again, computational linguistics is a great option to use. They have corpora in several different languages. They have a pretty robust Spanish language corpus. And then I also wanted to mention DataBasic. I think it's databasic.io. It's another web-based tool, and they have several different tools, one for network analysis, but also some for comparing text, for being able to do some word counts and whatnot. Yeah, and they also have some great teaching materials on there as well. So text analysis is probably one of the most obvious ways to explore primary sources from a computational lens. Here is a screenshot of Voyant, looking at William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberty. This is from the very first issue, and you'll see that, of course, Garrison himself is talked about the most, probably, especially later on in the issue, which could be something of interest. We know that because it was the first issue, there was a lot of explaining who he was and what his philosophies were, and you could look to see how he was discussed using the context. So this is a pretty robust tool. They do have topic modeling in here too, based on Mallet, but it gives you a little less control. So you could have assignments where you're just creating word clouds and asking students to macroscopically try to figure out what is this text about, or these texts based on a word cloud, for instance. So it's a pretty cool tool. Right, mapping is probably our next most accessible way to conduct computational analysis of primary sources. Geospatial analysis allows you to engage in both fictional and real maps and explore the role of geography and time. There are multiple ways of conducting geospatial analysis. For instance, you might take a corpus, say one you got from accessible archives or otherwise, and apply information extraction techniques like named entity recognition, or NER, to identify place names in the text, and then plot those on a map. Essentially, you're plugging in your text, and it's another document is spit out, that gives you all of the geolocation information that is in that text. And this would give you a visualization of the text, potentially, and help you explore a variety of questions, whether it's figuring out which places were discussed most often, or which were the most significant, or if there were any unexpected outliers. You can also manually add points to a map, going back to the Liberator. You might find a table that shows the number of Cherokee Indians removed from North Georgia, as is in the Liberator, and where they were forced to go. And you could plot these and look at how topography influenced their movement, or where they were forced to relocate. And combining other data sources such as this can help answer and explore complex topics. So for instance, you or students or whomever could create layered or multiple maps to illustrate change over time, taking, say, agricultural and census data to see the movement in people and change in geography due to climate change. And you could pull that information, say, from your primary sources, in order to examine how people have been affected by climate change. Another thing that you could do for, say, English literature is to plot out what places an author wrote at and how place and environment may have affected or influenced their writing and their characters. In any case, digital maps can embed all sorts of data, from images and videos to web links and spaces for public commentary. And so that gives you, or allows you to go beyond simply pinpointing and connecting important locations. And you can do some pretty cool stuff with primary sources. Just some quick examples: you could overlay historical maps over contemporary ones, trace phenomena across space and time, uncover the physical, historical, and visual networks that might be underlying a text, or you can create a map based on a literary text. So that's creating some fictional spaces, or fictional maps. And some of the skills that come from this, aside from lots of data and digital literacy, are the opportunities to recognize spatial and geographical patterns and convey complex ideas in the visual format of an interactive map. As far as tools, there's lots of options, And you can either dive into the intermediate or advanced stuff, and if you're brave, such as using ArcGIS or QGIS, or you can try some basic skill or basic tools to skill up. Ultimately, your research question and its complexity is usually a good place to start when thinking about which tool you might employ. If you're just using some basic maps and you want to pinpoint some stuff on that, you might just use Google Maps. But if you want to incorporate, say, networks and relationships, you bring in Palladio. And you could also try other tools like NightLab and Story. The NightLab tools, they're usually based off of some Google Sheets and other basic medium to be incorporated to create these interactive tools. So you can create a map that allows you to click a button and you are moving from one place on the map to another, and that can be organized by time or theme and not just place. Those are just a few of those on there. I do want to mention Esri Story Maps because I don't mention it next to digital storytelling, that it's a free tool. Esri creates ArcGIS, but they also have story maps and it's free, and it's a great tool to use for if you wanted to create a website of some kind or a web page rather. And they call it scrollytelling, so it's just really one page normally. And you can incorporate GIS data pretty easily, but it's a great multimedia interactive storytelling tool. And this was just meant to be an example of what you might think about in terms of creating maps. This is an image of the Cherokee and Choctaw Indians or Native Americans being relocated, their forced removal from North Georgia. So looking at the concentration of peoples. And so that might give you an idea of how are people distributed or forced to be distributed in order to be controlled, for instance. All right, so finally, I'd like to talk about digital storytelling. And although it's not a computational method, I wanted to talk about it because it is digital and it's a way to allow you to present your computational methods. So digital storytelling comes in a variety of formats and generally have the goal of telling some sort of story to contextualize data, primary sources, images, or other knowledge and evidence with some kind of interaction. In other words, digital storytelling is a combination of how to communicate information, whether it's a data visualization from Voyant of your text complemented with your narrative and explanation, or a digital exhibit using Omeka. It's also an opportunity to expose primary sources that wouldn't otherwise be shared in the same context. Digital storytelling is often thought of as a product, but you could also think about it as a method where you create some form of public scholarship or resource based on your primary sources and data that wouldn't be available otherwise because, say, a book or journal article or even a LibGuide may seem like inadequate mediums. So some uses that you might use for digital storytelling could be curating and presenting those primary sources, creating exhibits around those primary sources. You could create digital editions by essentially annotating a digital version of a text that wouldn't be available otherwise, as well as telling nonlinear stories. This might be something that, so a nonlinear story, it could be more exploratory, I guess, and more of a creative outlet, not necessarily a scholarly one, or maybe it can be. But the skills that come from this are certainly building public scholarship skills. Writing for the web is a skill in and of itself. You're building information organization and content management skills. And what I mean by that is being able to organize all of the things that you're going to put into your digital story or the digital storytelling platform. It's also a great way to foster creativity. And in terms of tools, Omeka is pretty popular for building digital exhibits. They do have a free trial version that does not have an expiration as far as I know. It is somewhat limiting compared to the full version, which you need some sort of hosting for, and that does cost money. But using the trial version in classes to have students think about creating metadata for primary sources and thinking about how you contextualize primary sources, the trial version is perfectly good at that. And Scalar is similar to that. It allows you to write long-form born digital scholarship. And you can assemble different types of media and juxtapose them with text. It really doesn't require much technical expertise. Twine, this is one of those nonlinear storytelling types of applications. It's basically like a choose your own adventure using hyperlinks. Let's see, and then Wikipedia, you could have, you could use that as a digital storytelling tool, most certainly, and write evidence-based scholarship for the world. And the last one I have on here is NodeGoat, which is in some ways a database type of tool for network data, but you can also create and visualize those networks and provide some sort of chronological context. So that one's probably the most advanced out of this list. And here is a screenshot of Omeka, so showing that you can incorporate lots of different media. And we have here, this is an ongoing project about, this is called Going North, so about the Great Migration, and in particular to Philadelphia. And you can see that they've created individual exhibits based on different categories of analysis of their primary sources, including oral histories. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about was this idea of skilling up. There are a lot of computational and digital methods out there and a ton of different tools. I've only mentioned a few really. And so where do you start if you want to skill up or work towards being able to support students and other researchers and faculty in this endeavor? So I wanted to present to you a few learning tools a few learning and teaching resources. And of course, this is not exhaustive. It's really just a starting point. Teachdh.com is probably one of my favorites for the undergraduate classroom. It's by Claire Battershill and Shauna Ross. They have a book companion to using digital humanities in the classroom, and teachdh.com is on the Scalar site that I mentioned earlier, and they have some fantastic discussions about how you would bring different digital humanities pedagogy into your work, and they have example assignments. It's really wonderful, and I hope that you'll look at it. Alan Liu's DH Toy Chest is created by Alan Liu, who's at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is, I believe, is an English faculty member. He has this website that is not just a collection of tools and organized by their applications and methods, but he also has several tutorials, and it's a really rich resource. The Dirt directory, which seems to be down, is another one. I don't have that on here because it's not working, but it's something similar that I recommend. And akin to that is Tapor. It's a database of all of the different tools organized by whatever you want to do with them. So if you're interested in creating a database or doing data visualization, or you want to do network analysis, or you're interested in some basic or complex text mining, it has the tools organized by that. In terms of tutorials, I'd recommend the Programming Historian. They have everything from coding in Python with regards to text mining, web scraping, to be able to build a corpus, to lots of GIS types of things. They're a pretty rich resource as well. And the Geospatial Historian, I know both of these say historian, but they're for everybody. And also the Programming Historian has lots of Spanish tutorials, not just in English. And finally, Miriam Posner, who's at UCLA. She's an information science faculty member. She has a blog and tutorials that are really fantastic as well. She has a great tutorial that I've recently used on Cytoscape for network analysis. So she's got some great stuff. And that's all I have. I do want to just say one quick note about mastery before we open up for Q&A. As Darby was saying, that if there is value in being a generalist, it can be exciting yet intimidating to launch yourself in new digital research methods and tools for engaging with primary sources. But having some kind of research project is a great place to start for building your skills, and of course utilizing these online tutorials and workshops. It can also be overwhelming, so I just want you to know that even many of the great digital humanists out there who are revered as experts in these methods and tools still view themselves as learners. And that's okay. You don't have to have expertise in all of these things. And again, instead, there's value in being a generalist and having some ideas of what the methods are and how they might be employed. So give yourself time and patience and embrace that learning is an ongoing process. Thanks.
Excellent. This is Mark from ACRL and Choice. As the screen says now, we've got about 15 minutes left for any questions that you folks out in the audience may have. So I would encourage you to take a minute now and maybe flip back through the slides, to refresh yourself, and pop any questions you have into the Q&A module. And we'll get to as many, like I said, as we have time for. We do have a few questions that have already come through, so I'll start working through those. But please do send in some more questions for us. Let's see. So we have a few that came through, I think, in the chat. So we have, I think, here a question from Susanna, who asks, are there any specific examples of how researchers have proved or argued something based off of the maps or the sort of mapping that you were showing a bit earlier, Nicole?
I can't think of any off the top of my head. That's something that I'm happy to get back to you on.
Yeah, it's maybe a little specific.
Yeah.
Or so she goes on to say, for example, you mentioned the author writing locations and how they affect the literature. Yeah, so sort of an extension of that same question. So we'll table that one and find some specific examples to share. Let's see, what else have we got for questions? So we've got one from Karen here who says, I was wondering about using iBooks Author as a publishing tool. Have you ever used that or anything similar, Nicole? Or do you have any thoughts on iBooks Author? Do you know that tool?
I haven't actually used iBooks Author, and I don't really know a whole lot about it. I tend not to use proprietary tools. I guess it's not necessarily proprietary. So I'm sorry, I'm not able to answer that very well.
To talk a lot about it. Sure, yeah. And I think if folks have questions about specific tools or those sorts of things, we may find that there are certain ones that folks use and certain ones that just we don't, so that's all right. So just a comment here from Jessica who says, not a question, but I had an art history class where we built an online exhibit in Omeka, and it was so fun, and it was a great learning experience. So, a vote of confidence for that tool. All right. So we have a question here from Rachel who says, hello, there was an idea mentioned of creating a list of go-to primary source databases. Would you please share some of your go-to primary source databases? And I would maybe throw that one out to Darby, since we've thrown a few at Nicole here. Are there specific databases that you go to a lot?
Yeah, that was actually my recommendation, was to have those go-to, to have some go-tos. I think it really depends on what's in the suite of content, databases that you have available to you. That's why I tried to pull out, honestly, part of why I agreed to do this webinar with Accessible Archives is because I'm a big fan of Accessible Archives. I think they do a wonderful job of giving you something like when I use the example of GOTIS, it's the complete run, it's complete content. And then it's content that can be approached from a number of different perspectives, and so that's what I was trying to demonstrate there. But I think it really depends on the suite of disciplines that you're working with, and really just kind of thinking that through with regard to what sorts of things you have access to at your institution.
All right. That makes sense. We've got a question, I think, here and maybe this would be interesting to get a perspective from each of you on. It came through the chat here, and it says, from Shatha, who says, great presentation, thank you. How can you get faculty to be engaged? And I think that's a pretty general question, but it's one I think that is always kind of bubbling there in the background. Do each of you have any specific ideas or maybe a time that you've worked closely with faculty that you could talk about? Do you have anything like that you could share, Nicole? I think you may be muted there, Nicole, if you're trying to talk.
I was muted, sorry. Thank you. I think outreach is probably one of the fun but sometimes difficult things that we have in terms of getting people engaged. Going to faculty meetings, so department meetings, and saying, hey, we know that you guys are interested in this, or are you interested in this? Is this something you would be interested in collaborating on? Also just keeping an eye open for curricular changes. If there's a new course that's been developed that you think might be something that you could be involved in, and just approaching that faculty member and saying, hey, I came across this new research tool. Is this something that you'd be interested in trying out in your class on a microscopic level or something? Otherwise, we tend to offer lots of workshops to help empower people and allow them to explore the different methods and tools that are out there. And then that tends to lead to consultations and further partnerships. I know that's pretty broad, but I hope that helps.
Yeah, definitely. And Darby, do you have anything that you'd like to add on that, on engaging faculty?
Yeah, I try to encourage liaisons to try to start with a small victory. Look for a place where you can really demonstrate value to a particular faculty, and then that tends to get them interested in then bringing to you the questions, the issues that they have. Now, the flip side of that, too, is that there's also another way you want the faculty to be engaged, is that you don't want them to just turn over these particular assignments or exercises or issues that they have to you, which some of them will do. And I think it's really important to be able to articulate that line of where the librarian ends. You know, we're supporting we're supporting the research, but they really have to carry and be engaged with the part where you really get into the course content, and you really sometimes need to encourage them to really articulate to you what are their particular pedagogical goals. And so then you can bring in the ideas, you can bring in the information sources, you can assist them with that, but you really have to get them and make sure that they stay engaged by being a peer with them and letting them take responsibility for the content, the disciplinary side of things.
All right, great. We've got a bunch more questions that have come in, so I'll just keep moving through them. And I think this one is probably, I'm certain this one is directed to Nicole from D. D asks, what resources are the best and most approachable for the novice who has little experience with computational analysis?
That's a great question, and that's why I wanted to put this list of learning and teaching resources. I really enjoy the Programming Historian. Those are peer-reviewed tutorials, and I find them to be pretty accessible, and there are some YouTube videos that could be complementary to those as well. That would be probably my starting point, and second to that, Miriam Posner's website.
Great.
If I may add something here, one thing that is also important is some of these tools are so simple to learn, and one of the things that can be articulated to faculty is that the faculty themselves oftentimes don't need to even learn the tool. They can use, library instruction or workshops or online tutorials to let their students learn the tool because some of them are that simple, and they still can be empowered to feel like, hey, I can grade the product of what they're doing without necessarily being an expert in the process. In the same way that they might feel comfortable grading a traditional research paper that was written on a word processing program without being an expert in all the bells and whistles of the word processor.
Great, great. We've got another question here coming through from Kathy. And Kathy says, have you used any tools to advertise or to market archival resources to faculty? Would any of these be useful for something like that?
I think so. I'm sure Darby has some ideas as well, but creating Omeka sites is something that a lot of special collections and archives tend to do, so that they can highlight those, the value and the information that is in those archives. Story maps as well. I think that that's a pretty useful tool. I hope that helps.
Great, yeah. And did you have anything you wanted to add there, Darby, or?
Well, marketing is always, is always a challenge, I think, for libraries. But particularly on the data end, that's one of the things. In fact, I spent the entire morning talking about, how to build better discovery, in a meeting talking about how to build better discovery for collections as data. But in terms of just promoting the resources that we have, I think that the best promotion is really getting them into the courses and having students be successful with them, because that success breeds further success.
Excellent, excellent. And just a quick plug here from Mark for some choice stuff. We do have a series of white papers on marketing the library that are available on our website. So if folks are looking for ideas there, you can definitely find those for free at choice.
And also, can I dive in for 1 second?
Of course. Go ahead, Iris.
I think it's very, very important that you remember that you're paying a lot of vendors a lot of money for primary source content. I can't talk to the open access material, but the stuff for which you're paying, feel free to get on the phone or email or whatever your vendor, because your vendor may well be willing to host a free webinar, may be willing to do something that is totally directed to your goal. And don't be shy or afraid of asking the vendor that you're spending money with to do something back in return for you.
Great point. Absolutely. All right. And zipping through the questions here, looking for one or two more to highlight. So we've got a question here from Larissa, who asks, are there any trade publications or websites that you recommend for keeping up with the new technical developments in the field of digital humanities? Are there places that you find yourself going to keep up with the changes in the field?
Aside from conferences, which I think is probably one of the best places to learn about new methods and how they're being employed, for librarians, and this is kind of a shameless plug, is DHNLib. The review is, I should know because I'm one of the editors, I think it's DHNLib, acrl.com, I think. In any case, DHNLib, it's an overlay journal where there are editors at large who select all kinds of different content from new projects to that may include new tools. That's a nice way to keep engaged with digital humanities and librarianship and scholarship, if that helps.
Definitely, definitely. All right, we are coming fast approaching the end of our time today. I know there are more questions here than we could get to. I think the plan is right now to take those, and we'll put together responses to them. I believe that's the case. So we'll try to make those available on the website, on the marketing page for this webinar. And before we go, I just want to be sure to thank you, Darby and Nicole and Iris, for putting this all together, and Bob here too, for putting this all together and presenting all of this information. I think it's been really informative and interesting, and clearly people are engaged in the topic. So thanks again for taking some time to talk with us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
you
you.
all. Yes.
All right, and before everybody takes off, I'd remind you that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for that follow-up email from ACRL and Choice with a link to the recording. And also, you should see a link to our brief 6-question survey in the chat box. If you could take a minute to fill that out and let us know how we did, we would really appreciate it. Thanks again to all of you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the session and have an excellent rest of your day. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.